in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Another layer to their significance. The sapphire and diamond brooch had once belonged to Queen Mary before it was passed down to Diana as a wedding gift. She had worn it not only at formal engagements but also in less public moments, pairing it with tailored jackets in a way that redefined royal fashion. The pearl drop earrings were among her most elegant possessions, often chosen for charity galas where she wished to strike a tone of dignity and grace. The bracelet, delicate but rich in meaning, had been a personal gift from a Middle Eastern royal family during a tour that showcased her ability to connect with people across cultures. Since Diana's passing, these pieces had been handled with utmost care. They were not simply locked away. They were preserved as part of her enduring legacy, each one symbolizing a moment in her life that her sons carried with them. William, in particular, had been vocal about ensuring his mother's possessions were protected. For him, they were not merely heirlooms, but tangible links to a woman whose absence was felt every day. When Catherine had first joined the family, she had been shown parts of the collection, not as a privilege of status, but as a gesture of trust. Over the years, she had worn certain pieces for special occasions, always mindful of their history. She understood that wearing them was not about personal adornment, but about carrying forward Diana's presence in moments that mattered. That was why the thought of them being unaccounted for felt so deeply wrong. It was not just a breach of security. It was a violation of memory. The disappearance of such pieces could not be explained away as a clerical error. It required intent, access, and a willingness to cross a line that most within the palace would never dare to approach. In the days following her discovery, Catherine began speaking discreetly to staff who had been in service long enough to know the collection's history. She listened to her accounts of how pieces were logged, who was permitted access, and what security measures were in place. The same sentiment echoed in each conversation. For something to vanish from the royal vaults without record, someone with authority had to be involved. The more she learned, the more her unease grew. These jewels were not just missing, they had been taken. The question that remained was where they had gone and why. Catherine knew the answers would not be easy to find, but she also knew she could not stop looking. An unlikely trail. The first tangible lead came from an unexpected source. Catherine was reviewing correspondence from various royal patrons when a letter from a trusted charity associate in Paris caught her attention. Tucked between updates about an upcoming fundraiser was a casual mention of a private auction in Monaco. The letter's author, a woman well connected in elite circles, noted she had seen a striking sapphire and diamond brooch listed in the catalogue, a piece she was certain had belonged to Diana. She assumed it must have been loaned out by the family for charity purposes, but Catherine knew no such arrangement had been made. That evening, Catherine retrieved her laptop and searched for images from the Monaco auction. There it was, the same brooch photographed under bright lights. The catalogue description, carefully omitting its royal history, but hinting at a distinguished provenance. The estimated value was staggering, but what caught her attention more was the discreet note that it had already been sold to a private collector. Her pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. She quietly contacted her associate asking for any further details about the auction and its sellers. A few days later, she received a reply containing a list of lots sold that night, along with discreet photographs of the auction's preview event. In one of the images, blurred in the background, was a figure Catherine recognized instantly as a senior aide from the palace, who was not usually involved in the handling of royal jewels. It was the connection she to begin pulling at the thread. She spoke to William that night, showing him the photographs and the auction listing. His reaction was one of restrained fury, the kind that came when betrayal touched something personal. He agreed they needed to proceed cautiously. If this was happening in connection with Diana's collection, there was no telling how many pieces had been sold quietly, and how deep the involvement went. Over the next week, Catherine instructed a small, trusted circle to monitor international auction houses and private sales. Within days, 2 more familiar items surfaced. The pearl drop earrings appeared in a catalogue for an exclusive Geneva auction described as from a distinguished European collection. The delicate bracelet was photographed in the hands of a London-based dealer known for discreet transactions with wealthy clients. Each discovery deepened the sense that this was no opportunistic theft, but a deliberate organized effort to sell off pieces of immense sentimental and historical value. The fact that the transactions were happening internationally suggested a network, one with both access and confidence that their actions would remain undetected. Still, Catherine was careful not to accuse without proof. She gathered each detail, each image, each trace of a sale into a private dossier, knowing that once she made a move, the consequences would be irreversible. The trail was becoming clearer, and it was leading back toward the palace itself. Whoever was orchestrating this believed they were untouchable, shielded by status and position. Catherine knew that illusion was about to be broken. Catherine's discovery. It was a late afternoon and early spring when Catherine's search took an unexpected turn from suspicion to certainty. She had arranged a quiet meeting with a senior member of the Royal Archives team, someone who had been in service since before Diana's time, and who understood the sensitive nature of what she was investigating. The meeting took place in one of the lesser-used library rooms, far from the steady flow of palace staff. There, with the doors shut and the heavy curtains drawn, Catherine was shown a set of internal movement records that were never meant to leave the archives. These records detailed each time an item from the royal jewelry collection was signed out, whether for cleaning, appraisal, or use. Catherine's eyes scanned the pages, the familiar names of staff appearing in the columns alongside dates and authorization signatures. Most of the entries were routine, but then she saw a cluster of authorizations for the missing pieces, all dated within a few weeks of each other, and all signed under the authority of Camilla. Her breath caught. The signature was unmistakable. There was no intermediary, no disguised handwriting. The paperwork presented the transactions as if they were official loans for undisclosed events, but there was no record of the items being returned. It was a paper trail that someone had assumed would remain buried in a place only a few eyes ever looked. Catherine asked if there had been any corresponding photographic logs or receipts from the jewelers or handlers involved. The archivist hesitated before producing a slim envelope from his folder. Inside were copies of 2 email confirmations between the palace's jeweler and an external appraiser in Geneva. Both messages referenced valuations that matched the pieces in question with no indication they were ever intended to be brought back into the collection. The appraisals were dated just days before those same jewels had appeared in international auction catalogs. A question of whether Camilla had been involved, but why she had risked so much. Was it greed, revenge, or an attempt to weaken their position in the eyes of the public and the monarchy? As Catherine closed the folder, she felt a shift from investigation to action. They had enough to bring this directly to the king. But such a move would not only alter the day's headlines, it could permanently reshape the family's internal balance of power. The truth had been uncovered, and now it was a matter of what to do with it. The next step would determine more than the fate of the missing jewels. It would decide the fate of Camilla herself, the confrontation. The meeting was arranged for late in the evening, long after the last of the palace staff had gone home. It took place in the king's private study, a room lined with centuries-old books and portraits that seemed to watch in silent judgment. William and Catherine arrived first, the investigative report in Catherine's hands. They waited in the kind of stillness that made the ticking of the grandfather clock feel like a drum beat. When Camilla entered, she carried herself with the same air of confidence she always wore, though there was the faintest flicker of weariness in her eyes. Charles remained behind his desk, his posture straight, but his expression shadowed. He gestured for everyone to sit, but Catherine remained standing, placing the report squarely on the desk before him. William's voice was steady as he explained the contents of how the missing jewels had been traced from the vaults to international auctions. The authorization signed in Camilla's own hand, the intermediary with documented ties to her circle. He did not raise his voice, but each word carried the weight of accusation. Camilla glanced briefly at the documents, then leaned back in her chair. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that certain items had been moved for valuation and potential insurance updates. She insisted there had been no sales, no intent to remove anything permanently from the collection. Her tone was calm, but her gaze avoided the sharp eyes of Catherine, who knew the report disproved every word. Catherine stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. She recounted the timeline of the removals, the appraisals in Geneva, the photographs from Monaco, and the financial trail that led back to an associate in Camilla's inner circle. She spoke not as a daughter-in-law, but as the protector of Diana's legacy, making it clear that the matter was not only about theft, but about betrayal. Charles listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. He had always valued family unity, but the evidence before him was too substantial to dismiss. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt dense, the kind of heavy stillness that comes before a breaking point. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with disappointment more than anger. He asked Camilla if she had anything else to say before he made his decision. Her reply was measured, but there was no true denial, only a deflection about priorities, public appearances, and the need to manage resources. It was the kind of answer that sidestepped guilt, but did nothing to erase it. Charles looked from Camilla to William and Catherine, the tension between them as visible as the lamplight pooling on the polished desk. By the time the meeting ended, the path forward was clear. The king would have to act not only to protect the royal legacy, but to prevent further erosion of trust within the family. As Catherine left the room, she felt no sense of victory. Only the certainty that what came next would shake the palace walls far more than anything that had come before. The king's verdict. The hours after the confrontation were some of the longest Catherine could remember. She and William retreated to their private quarters, knowing the decision now rested solely with the king. Charles was not a man who moved quickly when faced with personal crises. He measured consequences, weighed optics, and considered the long arc of the monarchy before taking a step. Yet this time the stakes were unusually personal. The evidence was irrefutable, the damage to trust undeniable, and the emotional wound to his eldest son impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, Charles sought counsel from a handful of his most trusted advisers. They spoke cautiously, aware of the thin line between offering guidance and appearing to take sides. The Lord Chamberlain stressed the importance of protecting the integrity of the royal collection, reminding the king that any hint of impropriety could erode public trust. Another advisor warned of the inevitable media frenzy if the truth leaked, urging swift and decisive action before the press could shape the narrative. Charles paced the study, his mind caught between loyalty to his wife and his duty as sovereign. He could recall the public battles that had marked his earlier years with Camilla, the decades spent defending their relationship against scrutiny. Yet, here was a situation that struck at the very heart of the institution he had sworn to protect. Diana's jewels were not just property. They were a living thread to a woman whose memory still loomed large in the public consciousness. Allowing their quiet removal and sale to go unanswered would send a message of weakness he could not afford. In the early hours of the morning, Charles made his choice. He summoned William and Catherine back to the study. His face drawn but resolute, he told them he had decided to remove Camilla from all direct involvement with royal assets. Effective immediately. She would be asked to vacate her rooms at Buckingham Palace and relocate to a lesser royal residence. Her public engagements would be suspended indefinitely, and her staff reassigned. Though she would retain her title, her influence would be reduced to ceremonial appearances only. Charles made it clear that the decision was not made lightly. He admitted that it pained him to take such measures against someone he had fought for. But the integrity of the monarchy and the trust of his son came first. Catherine listened in silence, her relief tempered by the knowledge of how public and painful this would soon become. William thanked his father, his voice steady, but his eyes revealing the strain of the past weeks. Later that day, the official announcement was drafted in the careful language of police communications. It made no mention of the jewels or the investigation, citing only our assessment of roles and responsibilities within the royal household. But those inside the palace knew the truth, and in those circles, the king's verdict marked a turning point. By nightfall, the corridors were alive with whispers. Camilla had not yet been told directly, but everyone understood the weight of what was coming. The king had drawn his line, and there would be no stepping back from it now. Camilla's banishment. The summons came in the late afternoon. Camilla had been in her private rooms at Clarence's house reviewing correspondence and planning her upcoming charity appearances when a discreet knock at the door announced the presence of one of the king's senior aides.